There's a photograph that still circulates from time to time, taken on a snowy Nevada mountainside in the winter of 1942. A group of exhausted men stand in waist-deep snow, and among them is a man the whole world recognized, looking nothing like the king of Hollywood. He looked like someone who had just lost everything. That moment sat at the center of a life shaped by 5 marriages, one wartime tragedy, and a kind of restlessness the cameras never quite caught. This is the story of the 5 women who shared his name. The teacher who built a king. Before there was a king of Hollywood, there was a lanky, poor young man from Cadiz, Ohio, drifting through odd jobs and small theater troupes with no clear sense of where his life was headed. His mother died when he was still an infant, and he spent his earliest years being passed between relatives before his father eventually remarried and brought him back home. That stepmother turned out to be a gentle, steadying presence in his early childhood, encouraging his interest in music and reading. But she too passed away while he was still a teenager, leaving him once again without the kind of stable home life most people take for granted. He dropped out of school in his mid-teens and drifted through a string of manual jobs, including stretches working the oil fields of Oklahoma and Texas, the kind of back-breaking labor that left little room for dreaming about a different life. But somewhere along the way, he saw a stage production that changed something in him. He couldn't have told you exactly why it struck him the way it did, only that afterward, he knew he wanted to be the one standing under those lights, not sitting in the audience watching someone else. He talked his way into an unpaid position with a traveling theater company and eventually found his way into a troupe performing in the Pacific Northwest, chasing something he couldn't quite name yet. It was in a Portland, Oregon theater troupe that he crossed paths with a woman named Josephine Dillon. She was a drama coach, nearly 2 decades his senior, disciplined and exacting, in a way the young performer had never encountered. She saw something in him that nobody else had bothered to look for. Not raw talent, exactly, but potential, the kind that could be shaped with enough patience and enough work. And work it, she did. Dillon didn't just teach him how to read a line. She rebuilt him, almost from the ground up, treating the process less like acting lessons and more like the construction of an entirely new person. She trained his voice, which she considered too thin and reedy for the stage, deepening it into the resonant baritone that would one day fill movie theaters across the country. She worked on his posture, his movement, even his teeth. At one point, helping arrange for dental work that gave him the confident smile audiences would come to know. She taught him how to walk into a room like he belonged there, how to hold a pause, how to let silence do the work that nervous chatter usually ruined. Whatever awkwardness he carried into her studio, she was determined to smooth it away, one habit at a time. And by every account, he was a willing and disciplined student, showing up for lessons at hours most young men his age would have spent anywhere else. In December of 1924, the two of them married in Los Angeles, and shortly afterward, Dillon made the decision that would change both of their lives. She moved them to Hollywood, using her own savings and connections to help her new husband and pupil find a foothold in the industry. For a while, it worked exactly as she'd hoped. He picked up small parts, bit roles, the kind of unglamorous work every unknown actor has to grind through. But something else was happening too, something Dillon likely hadn't planned for. As his confidence grew and his name started to circulate, the balance between them began to shift. He was no longer just her student. He was becoming a leading man, and leading men, in that era of Hollywood, tended not to stay married to the older women who'd built them from nothing. By 1930, the marriage had quietly ended in divorce, with reports at the time suggesting he'd left with little more than the clothes on his back, determined to make his own way without leaning on her name or her savings any further. Dillon never remarried, and she continued coaching actors for years afterward, largely out of the spotlight, watching from a distance as the pupil she'd shaped became one of the most famous faces in the world until her death from pneumonia in 1971 at the age of 87. Whatever bitterness lingered between them, and by most accounts there was plenty on her side, she had done what she set out to do. She had made a star. She simply wasn't going to be the one standing beside him when the fame finally arrived. Because almost immediately, another woman was already waiting to take her place. And this one wouldn't just shape his career. She'd shape the image the entire country would fall in love with. And she'd stay by his side through some of the messiest, most closely guarded secrets of his early stardom. The socialite who sold the fantasy. If Josephine Dillon gave him the tools, the second wife gave him the polish. Her name was Rhea Langham, sometimes recorded as Maria Franklin Prentice Lucas Langham, a wealthy Texas socialite who was, once again, considerably older than he was, by most accounts around 17 years his senior. The two had met in the late 1920s, while his first marriage was still technically intact, but already unraveling, and by the time he divorced Dillon, Langham was firmly established in his life. They married in June of 1931 at a courthouse in Santa Ana, California, and on paper, it looked like an odd pairing. A rising, rugged young actor and a refined, older woman from Texas oil money who had already been married and divorced more than once before she ever met him. But it made a strange kind of sense. Langham understood high society in a way he never could on his own. She'd grown up around wealth, around dinner parties and formal introductions, and she knew instinctively which people needed impressing and which ones could be politely ignored. She knew how a rising star was supposed to carry himself once the cameras stopped rolling, how to dress for a premiere, how to make small talk with studio executives without seeming desperate for their approval. Under her guidance, the rough edges he still carried from his years scraping by in regional theatre began to disappear entirely. She helped smooth him into something the public could adore rather than merely notice. And during those years, his career didn't just grow, it exploded. He signed with a major studio, began appearing in one picture after another, and audiences responded to him in a way that surprised even the executives who'd taken a chance on him. Within a few short years, he'd gone from an unknown supporting player to one of the most requested leading men in the entire industry, cast opposite the biggest female stars of the day, his salary and his billing climbing with almost every new release. This was the stretch of his life where he became, unmistakably, a movie star. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1934. He was being cast opposite the biggest actresses of the era, his face plastered across magazine covers, his name synonymous with a kind of confident, effortless masculinity that audiences couldn't get enough of. And it was also, quietly, the period when his marriage to Langham began to strain under the weight of exactly that kind of fame. Because the truth was, the more famous he became, the harder it got for Langham to keep him close. Rumours of affairs followed him through the decade, a much-discussed connection with actress Joan Crawford, whom he'd first worked with in the early years of his contract and continued crossing paths with throughout the 1930s. The two shared an obvious chemistry on screen that audiences noticed immediately, and off-screen, gossip columns speculated endlessly about just how far that chemistry extended. Crawford herself, in later years, would hint that the connection between them had been real, even if it never became anything permanent. And then, in 1935, something happened that would remain hidden from the public for decades. While filming a movie set in the snowy wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, alongside a young actress named Loretta Young, the two began a relationship that went further than either of their studios could afford to let the public know about. The location shoot kept the cast isolated for weeks at a time, far from the usual watchful eyes of Hollywood, and whatever distance existed between them at the start of filming had closed considerably by the end of it. Young became pregnant not long after. In an era where an unmarried pregnancy could destroy a career overnight, and where the father in question was already married, the studio system did what it always did in moments like this. It buried the story before it could ever surface. Young quietly withdrew from public view for a stretch of months, later returning with a baby girl she claimed to have adopted through an orphanage. The girl, named Judy, was raised believing that story for most of her early life. It would take decades, well into adulthood, before the truth about her parentage was ever acknowledged by the family involved. Through all of it, Langham held on, far longer than many in her position might have. She endured years of rumor and speculation, watching her husband's fame climb higher and higher while her own place in his life grew shakier with every passing year. Friends of the couple later said that Langham genuinely loved him, in her own way, and that part of what kept her holding on was the hope that his wandering attention would eventually settle. It didn't. By the late 1930s, something else had entered the picture. Someone who wasn't content to simply wait around while he sorted out where his heart actually belonged. And someone Langham, by most accounts, recognized as different from the passing infatuations that had come before. The divorce, when it finally came, was handled with more public grace than the tabloids of the era might have expected. But there was no mistaking what it meant. And this time, everything about how he loved was about to change. The woman who made him feel like someone else entirely. Her name was Carol Lombard, and by the time they truly fell for each other, she was already one of the most magnetic personalities in Hollywood. Sharp-witted, unapologetically herself, known for a kind of blunt, playful humor that stood in total contrast to the glamorous, untouchable persona most female stars cultivated at the time. The two had actually met years earlier, on a film set in the early 1930s, and reportedly hadn't clicked at all. But when their paths crossed again later in the decade, something had shifted. By then, he was still technically married to Langham, and their relationship together developed the way so many Hollywood romances of that era did. Quietly, carefully, while lawyers worked out the details of a divorce that neither the studio nor the public could rush. Lombard, unlike some of the other women in his past, wasn't interested in playing games or pretending. Friends who knew them both often remarked that she treated him less like a movie idol and more like an ordinary man, teasing him, pranking him, refusing to let him take himself too seriously. And it seemed to be exactly what he needed. The moment his divorce from Langham was finalized in March of 1939, he and Lombard didn't wait long. They married within days, in a small, low-key ceremony, far from the Hollywood press machine that had covered every other chapter of his romantic life. For the first time, it didn't feel like a marriage built out of career necessity or convenience. It felt, to nearly everyone who observed them, like two people who genuinely enjoyed being around each other. They settled into a working ranch in the San Fernando Valley, away from the noise of the city, where by most accounts he could finally let his guard down. It was a modest, unglamorous property by movie star standards, with chickens, orange trees, and a barn that actually got used, and both of them seemed to prefer it that way. Lombard rode horses, hunted, cursed like a sailor when she felt like it, and had absolutely no interest in being anyone's idea of a delicate movie star. She was known for her practical jokes almost as much as her talent, the kind of person who'd needle him mercilessly in front of friends, just to watch him try to keep a straight face. And rather than being put off by it, he seemed to come alive around her in a way people close to him hadn't seen before. for a man who'd spent over a decade being shaped and managed by the women around him, first as a student, then as a social project. Being with someone who simply liked him for who he actually was seemed to be its own kind of relief. There was no agenda in the relationship, no sense that she needed him to be anything other than exactly what he already was. Colleagues on set during those years often remarked that he laughed more easily, worked more relaxed, and generally carried himself like a man who had finally stopped performing even when the cameras weren't rolling. It's often said, by those who study his life, that this marriage was the one where he was truly, fully happy. And for close to 3 years, it looked as though nothing could touch it. Then, the world changed. In December of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the Second World War, and almost overnight, the entertainment industry mobilized alongside everyone else. He became chairman of a Hollywood committee organized to support the war effort. And when the Treasury Department asked for a well-known face to help sell war bonds, Lombard didn't hesitate. It was her home state of Indiana that needed a boost, and she was determined to be the one to deliver it. What happened next would end their story in a way neither of them could have imagined, and it would leave a mark on him that never fully healed. The night that changed everything. In January of 1942, Lombard traveled to Indiana with her mother, Elizabeth Peters, and a press agent named Otto Winkler, who also happened to be one of his closest friends. She'd made the trip out by train, unwilling to face several days cooped up in a rail car, but going along with the advice she'd been given about wartime air travel being unreliable. Crowds turned out for her across the state in numbers organizers hadn't anticipated, drawn by the simple fact that one of the biggest stars in the country had come home to ask them, personally, to help pay for the war. She worked the crowds with real warmth, encouraging people again and again to do their part. And by the time her tour reached its final stop in Indianapolis, the atmosphere had built into something closer to a rally than a simple fundraiser. The trip was, by every measure, a triumph. In a single evening, she helped raise around $2 million in defense bonds, a staggering figure for the time, achieved through sheer charisma and the kind of hometown pride that only a native daughter could inspire, doubling the original goal organizers had set for her. She'd been advised, at several points, to travel home by train as well, rather than by air, given the uncertainties of wartime travel and the safety concerns that came with it. For most of the outbound trip, she'd taken that advice. But on the return journey, she wanted to get home faster. She and her small party boarded a transcontinental and Western air flight, a twin-engine passenger plane making its way west with a refueling stop planned in Las Vegas. At one earlier stop, she'd nearly been bumped from the flight altogether, as military personnel were given boarding priority during wartime. But she pushed to keep her seat, arguing that she, too, had just done her part for the war effort. On the evening of January 16th, the aircraft lifted off from Las Vegas for the final leg of the journey to Burbank. It was dark, and because of wartime blackout regulations, many of the usual lighted navigation beacons along the route had been switched off. Roughly 15 minutes after takeoff, the plane deviated from its intended course and struck the sheer cliff face of Potosi Mountain, a rugged peak southwest of Las Vegas. All 22 people aboard were killed instantly, including Lombard, her mother, his friend Otto Winkler, and 15 young soldiers who had been given priority seats on that very flight. He was in Los Angeles when the news reached him. He immediately traveled toward Nevada with studio executives, holding on to the hope, as long as he possibly could, that somehow she had survived. He took up residence in a small hotel near the base of the mountain range, while others made the brutal climb up the slope to confirm what by then almost everyone already suspected. The terrain was some of the harshest in the region, steep and covered in loose rock, even without the layer of winter snow, and the recovery crews who eventually reached the wreckage described a scene that none of them were prepared for, the impact having been so violent that there was little left to recognize. He waited at that hotel for days, refusing at first to accept what colleagues gently tried to tell him, until there was simply no version of the story left where she came home. When the truth finally settled in, those who saw him during that stretch described a man who seemed to physically shrink, his usual commanding presence replaced by something quiet and hollow. The funeral was small and private, nothing like the spectacle Hollywood might have staged for a star of her stature, because that kind of public display was the last thing he could bear. Those closest to him would later describe a man who never fully recovered from that loss. He reportedly withdrew for weeks, barely speaking, unable to process the fact that the one relationship that had finally felt uncomplicated and real had been taken from him in a matter of seconds, thousands of feet up a mountainside he would never visit. Within months, in a decision many around him saw as an attempt to outrun his own grief, he enlisted in the armed forces, despite being older than the standard age for new recruits and having no obligation to serve. He trained as an aerial gunner, earned his commission, and was assigned to lead a small motion picture unit tasked with documenting the war effort from the air, stationed for much of his service at English airfields. But rather than staying safely behind a camera, he insisted on flying real combat missions himself, eventually completing 5 separate bombing runs aboard heavy aircraft between the spring and fall of 1943, including at least one mission deep into German airspace. An extraordinarily dangerous role for a man who, by every account, no longer seemed to care much whether he came home. He earned real military honors for his service, including the Air Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. But colleagues who served alongside him often said he simply didn't behave like someone trying to survive the war. He behaved like a man who had already lost the thing worth surviving for, volunteering for the kind of missions that other men, given the choice, would have quietly avoided. When the war ended and he eventually returned to filmmaking, something in him had visibly changed. The easy charm was still there on screen, because that's what the job required of him. His first post-war picture arrived with a promotional tagline that tried to recapture the old magic, promising audiences that their leading man was back. But the film itself struggled, and critics noted a heaviness in his performance that hadn't been there before the war. He found steadier ground a couple of years later with a satire about the advertising world, a role that suited his more weathered, world-worn presence. Off-camera, though, the people around him described someone quieter, someone who had aged in ways that had nothing to do with the years actually passing. He drifted through a few short, well-publicized romances in those years, including a brief relationship with actress Paulette Goddard, but nothing that carried the weight of what he'd lost. It would be 7 long years before he tried marriage again, and when he finally did, it would be with a woman whose own past carried an eerie echo of loss he understood all too well. A widow's companion, and a marriage built on loneliness. By the end of the 1940s, he had drifted through a string of highly publicized romances without ever settling down. Brief relationships with actresses that filled gossip columns but never seemed to go anywhere lasting. Then, in 1949, he met a British-born socialite named Sylvia Ashley, a woman who understood something about grief that few others in his social circle could relate to. Ashley had, several years earlier, been married to one of the biggest stars of the previous generation of Hollywood, a swashbuckling leading man whose adventure pictures had defined an earlier era of the industry, until his death in 1939 left her a widow. She'd actually been married multiple times before that as well, moving through English aristocratic circles with a string of titled husbands, which was how she came to be known publicly as Lady Ashley, even years later. She carried herself with a formal, old-world elegance that had little in common with the ranch and rifle lifestyle Lombard had once shared with him. In some ways, the two of them found each other at a point where neither was looking for a grand romance so much as companionship. Two people who understood, on some level, what it felt like to have loved someone larger than life and then lost them entirely. There was a comfort, at least at first, in being with someone who didn't need an explanation for the kind of grief that still followed him around a decade later. She'd lived through her own version of public mourning, having spent years as a widow answering the same questions from reporters about a marriage that had already ended. And there was something almost restful, for both of them, in not having to explain that particular kind of exhaustion to each other. They married in December of 1949, and almost immediately, cracks began to show. Ashley was used to a certain kind of English aristocratic lifestyle, refined social circles, formal etiquette, servants trained to a particular standard, an entirely different rhythm of living than the one he preferred. She reportedly tried to redecorate his ranch home to reflect her own tastes, replacing the plain, practical furnishings he'd kept since his years with Lombard, a change that apparently bothered him far more than he ever said out loud at the time. He, on the other hand, was still very much a man who liked hunting trips, quiet ranch life, and the company of old friends over stuffy dinner parties full of people he barely knew. Friends of the couple often noted that they simply wanted different things out of daily life, and no amount of shared history with loss could bridge that particular gap. The marriage lasted a little over 2 years before the two divorced in the spring of 1952. It's often described, by those who chronicled his life, as the least emotionally significant of his 5 marriages. Not a bitter split exactly, but not a great love story either. It seemed, in hindsight, like the marriage of two lonely people trying to fill a space that neither of them could actually fill for the other. Two people who had reached for comfort and found, instead, just how different their idea of a life together really was. But even as that chapter closed quietly, an old connection from years earlier was waiting to resurface. Someone he'd known long before either of them found their way to Hollywood stardom, and someone who would ultimately give him something none of his previous marriages ever had. What started as a familiar, low-key friendship would quietly become the steadiest relationship of his entire life. The woman who finally gave him a family. Her name was Kay Williams, though she would later go by Kay Spreckles, having previously been married into the wealthy Spreckles sugar family before that marriage ended in divorce. She'd worked for years as a model and had a modest career in film herself, though she was never quite the household name that some of the women in his past had been. What made her different from nearly everyone else in this story was that she wasn't a new face who'd swept into his orbit during some passing infatuation. The two had actually known each other since the late 1940s, crossing paths socially long before their romance ever became serious, and by most accounts, there had always been a quiet, unspoken spark between them that neither had acted on while other marriages and relationships took priority. Friends who watched the relationship unfold over the years often said it felt less like falling in love for the first time and more like two people finally circling back to something they'd both known was there all along. By 1955, both of them were free. Both had weathered their share of loss and disappointment. And this time, when they came together, it felt less like a whirlwind and more like something settling comfortably into place. They married in July of that year, and he took on an unfamiliar role for the first time in his life: stepfather. Kay had 2 children from her earlier marriage, a son and a daughter, and he welcomed them into a household that, for the first time in his adult life, actually resembled something like a family home rather than a movie star's estate. He reportedly took the role seriously, showing up for the small, ordinary moments of family life that his career and his previous marriages had never really allowed for. Those who knew him during this final stretch of his life often described a noticeably calmer man, someone who no longer needed the constant reassurance of a new romance or a new project to feel settled. The restlessness that had defined much of his younger years, the constant searching that had carried him through 4 marriages already, finally seemed to quiet down. He still worked, still took on major film roles, but he also seemed, for the first time in a long while, genuinely content to simply come home at the end of the day, to sit on the porch of the same ranch he'd once shared with Lombard, now filled again with the sound of a family moving through its rooms. And then, in 1960, came the kind of news that must have felt almost unbelievable after everything he'd been through. At 59 years old, Kay was expecting their first child together. Friends who saw him during that stretch described a man who was practically giddy with the news, telling colleagues on set about the pregnancy with an openness that surprised people who remembered how private he'd always been about his personal life. For a man who had spent decades being defined, in the public imagination, by glamour and heartbreak in equal measure, the idea of finally becoming a father in any acknowledged, public way was something entirely new, and by all accounts, something he'd wanted for a very long time without ever quite admitting it out loud. He wouldn't live to see it happen. But the story of how that final year of his life unfolded is, in its own quiet way, just as heartbreaking as anything that came before it. The final role, and the ending no one saw coming. In the summer and fall of 1960, he was working on what would become his final film, a drama about aging cowboys and Mustang hunters, shot in the punishing heat of the Nevada desert, co-starring Marilyn Monroe, and directed by John Huston from a script written by Arthur Miller. By every account, it was a grueling shoot. He was 59 years old, had spent decades as a heavy smoker and a fairly steady drinker, and had already experienced warning signs of heart trouble on at least 2 occasions in the years prior. And yet, true to the reputation he'd built over his entire career, he insisted on performing many of his own stunts, including scenes that required him to be dragged behind a moving truck at speeds that alarmed even the crew, and to physically wrestle with a bucking, unbroken horse under the desert sun, take after take. The production itself tested him in other ways, too. Monroe frequently arrived hours late to set, struggling with her lines and with difficulties of her own that would eventually follow her for the rest of her short life. And the delays stretched what should have been a manageable shoot into an exhausting, drawn-out ordeal. Tensions ran high enough that he was seen walking off set in frustration on at least one occasion, after a stunt double was injured and the director still wanted another take. The physical demands of the role, combined with his effort to shed weight for the part, put real strain on a body that had already been carrying decades of hard living. On the last day of filming, in early November, he reportedly expressed relief that the picture was finally finished, joking with those nearby about how exhausting the whole experience had been, and how his co-star's unpredictability had nearly worn him out for good. 2 days later, he suffered a serious heart attack and was rushed to the hospital. For a short while, there was cautious optimism. But 10 days after that first attack, on November 16th, 1960, his heart gave out completely. He was 59 years old. The news landed across the country like the ending of an era, because in many ways, it was exactly that. Newspapers ran the story under headlines declaring that the king was dead, and the industry he'd helped define for over 3 decades went quiet for a moment to absorb it. His funeral was held a few days later at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, attended by many of the biggest names in Hollywood, with fellow actors serving as pallbearers and prominent directors and performers filling the pews to say goodbye. And in a detail that felt almost too fitting to be real, he was laid to rest in the crypt directly beside Carol Lombard, the woman whose loss, nearly 2 decades earlier, had never quite loosened its grip on him, even through 2 more marriages that followed. His widow, Kay, attended the funeral heavily pregnant with their child, standing among the actors and directors who had shaped his career, carrying the one part of him that hadn't been lost yet. Roughly 4 months later, on March 20th, 1961, she gave birth to a son, John Clark Gable, the only child he would ever be publicly known to father, born into the world just months after his own father had left it. The boy would go on to have his own modest career in film and racing, carrying the family name into a Hollywood that had changed almost beyond recognition from the one his father had once ruled. It was, in its own bittersweet way, the family he had spent 5 marriages searching for, arriving in the final chapter of a story that had already ended. 5 wives. 5 very different chapters in the life of a man the world knew as the King of Hollywood. A woman who built him from nothing and let him go the moment he no longer needed her. A woman who polished him for the spotlight while he quietly slipped away from her, chasing a fame that would eventually take him further from her than either of them could have predicted. A woman who gave him the one love story that felt entirely his own, before losing her in a way that would haunt every relationship that came after. A woman bound to him by shared grief that ultimately wasn't enough, on its own, to hold 2 very different lives together. And finally, a woman who gave him the quiet, ordinary family life he seemed to have been searching for the entire time, arriving just close enough for him to see it coming, but not quite close enough to hold it in his arms. What's left, looking back on all of it, isn't really a story about Hollywood glamour at all. It's the story of a man who spent nearly 40 years looking for something steady to hold on to, who found it exactly once, lost it in a matter of seconds on the side of a mountain, and spent the rest of his life quietly trying to find his way back to that feeling, through 4 more marriages, a war he didn't need to fight, and a final role he probably shouldn't have pushed his body through. He got close, in the end, closer than he had been in nearly 2 decades. Just not quite close enough. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.